Rational. That is the word nobody uses when they describe a 4-year-old who eats a marshmallow. They use impulsive, undisciplined, unable to delay gratification. They say that child, the one who couldn't wait 15 minutes for a second marshmallow, is going to struggle. With money, with education, with life. For 50 years, that conclusion sat at the center of one of the most widely cited studies in all of psychology. A study taught in universities, referenced in best-selling books, used to explain why some people build wealth and others do not. The study was wrong, not partially wrong, not slightly overstated. The core premise, that a child's ability to wait for a marshmallow predicts their financial future, has now been tested on a sample 10 times larger, followed into adulthood, and the relationship essentially disappears. But here is what makes this story more than a failed experiment. Because what the marshmallow test actually measured was not willpower at all. It measured something that the original researchers never considered. Something that changes everything about how we think about money, discipline, and who gets to succeed financially. Let us go back to 1970. Walter Mischel was a psychologist at Stanford University. He had been studying the mechanisms of self-control for years, why some people resist temptation and others do not. And he devised a deceptively simple test. A child aged 3 to 5 was brought into a room. A marshmallow was placed in front of them. The researcher offered a deal. Wait here alone, do not eat the marshmallow, and when I come back, you can have 2. Eat it now, and that is all you get. Then the researcher left for 15 minutes. The children who waited, Mischel found, showed better outcomes later in life. They had higher SAT scores as teenagers. They were rated by their teachers as more competent and socially capable. And in follow-up studies over the subsequent decades, they seemed to show better cognitive functioning, lower rates of obesity, and higher educational attainment. The message was irresistible. Delayed gratification is the secret ingredient. The ability to resist temptation at age 4 maps to success across an entire life. Teach children to wait, and you give them a better future. Master the impulse to spend now, and you will build wealth. Personal finance books absorbed this narrative entirely. The marshmallow test became shorthand for a particular theory of poverty. That financial difficulty reflects a failure of self-control. That if you are struggling with money, you are, in some meaningful sense, the child who ate the marshmallow. That theory turns out to be built on something close to nothing. In 2018, a team of researchers led by Tyler Watts at New York University decided to run the experiment again. Not a small follow-up study, a proper conceptual replication, with one critical difference. They used a sample of 918 children, drawn from a genuinely diverse population, not the Stanford University community. The original study's subjects were predominantly the children of Stanford academics and students, one of the most economically privileged populations on Earth. Watts and his colleagues published their findings in Psychological Science. When they controlled for socioeconomic background, for family income, for maternal education, for early cognitive ability, the predictive power of the marshmallow test on outcomes at age 15 dropped dramatically. In most cases, it became statistically indistinguishable from 0. The ability to wait for a second marshmallow, when you hold everything else constant, tells you almost nothing about what a child's future will look like. And then, in 2024, a study published in the journal Developmental Psychology followed the original Bing Nursery School participants, the actual children from Mischel's study, all the way into their 40s. What it found was striking. The children who had eaten the marshmallow immediately were, as adults, no more or less financially secure, no more or less educated, no more or less physically healthy than the children who had waited. Waiting time failed to forecast roughly a dozen adult outcomes tested, including net worth, social standing, and debt levels. The child who ate the marshmallow turned out to be just fine. Here is the question that the original researchers did not ask. What if eating the marshmallow immediately was the right decision? In 2012, a team at the University of Rochester ran a different version of the experiment. Before the marshmallow test, they split the children into two groups. One group experienced a reliable adult, someone who promised them art supplies, left and returned with exactly what they had said. The other group experienced an unreliable adult, who promised something, left and came back with an excuse. Then both groups faced the marshmallow test. Children who had experienced the reliable adult waited an average of 12 minutes. Children who had experienced the unreliable adult waited an average of 3 minutes. These children were not displaying impulsivity. They were drawing a rational conclusion from available evidence. If the adult who left the room has already demonstrated that promises do not hold, why would you surrender a certain reward for one that may never arrive? Celeste Kidd, who led the study, put it directly. Waiting is only the rational strategy if you believe the second marshmallow is actually coming. The marshmallow test did not measure willpower, it measured trust. A child's implicit assessment of whether the future is the kind of place where waiting pays off. Put differently, the test did not reveal what a child was made of. It revealed what the world had made them expect. The children in Mischel's original study who waited longest came predominantly from stable, affluent, academically enriched households. They waited not because they had superior willpower, but because everything in their experience had taught them that promised things arrive. The future was reliable. For a child from a household with unstable income or inconsistent caregiving, the same calculation produces a different answer. Take the marshmallow now before something changes. The immediate reward is the only certain one. This is the insight that Sendil Mulenathan and Eldar Shafir documented in their research on scarcity. When resources are uncertain, prioritizing the present is not a failure of discipline. It is the correct reading of available information. The behavior's personal finance culture labels as poor discipline, spending now rather than saving, preferring immediate certainty over future promises, avoiding markets you have been given no reason to trust, are often rational adaptations to a particular environment, not character flaws. Logical responses to the conditions a person has been taught to expect. The connection to our previous exploration of money scripts becomes impossible to ignore here. The vigilant saver who cannot enjoy what they have, the money worshipper convinced that the next milestone will finally be enough. Both patterns, as Clonce's research showed, are inherited from environments that shaped what money means and whether the future can be trusted. The marshmallow test adds a structural layer to that insight. The environment doesn't just shape your beliefs about money, it shapes whether the logic of delayed gratification is even rational given your life. And that is the line the original study never examined. So if self-control is not the variable driving financial outcomes, what is? The research since the 2018 replication points consistently toward factors that have almost nothing to do with willpower. Income stability. Predictability of resources across time. Access to financial institutions that are trustworthy. The socioeconomic conditions of the household a child grows up in. A 2023 analysis by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis found that the single strongest predictor of long-term financial health was not savings behavior or spending discipline. It was the economic environment a person was embedded in. Job stability, access to fair credit, intergenerational asset transfer. These are not variables that a 4-year-old can influence by leaving a marshmallow on a table. This matters because the marshmallow narrative has real consequences. When we believe financial outcomes are primarily determined by self-control, we build a culture around that belief. We create budgeting apps that gamify self-denial. We explain poverty as a consequence of poor impulse control rather than as the output of conditions that reliably produce it. And we hold individuals responsible for outcomes the evidence suggests were largely shaped before they ever sat down in front of a marshmallow. The evidence is not that delayed gratification is irrelevant. It is that delayed gratification is more a symptom of structural conditions than a cause of outcomes. Circumstances shape the capacity for delay. The capacity for delay does not independently create circumstances. Kidd's reliability study makes this plain. When children experienced a dependable adult before the test, they waited significantly longer. Not because their willpower increased, because the rational case for waiting had been established. The capacity was always there. The environment had to make it worth using. This is what the Marshmallow test, correctly read, actually tells us. It is not a story about willpower. It is a story about what happens when you ask someone to trust a future that their entire lived experience has given them no reason to trust. That theory, that financial outcomes live primarily inside a person's character rather than in the conditions surrounding them, turns out to be precisely wrong in the direction that benefits those who are already doing well. If outcomes are about character, the wealthy deserve their wealth and the struggling deserve their struggle. If outcomes are about environments, trust, and the inherited logic of how resources behave, the picture is considerably less comfortable for everyone who has used a Marshmallow story to explain why some people are simply better with money. Delayed gratification is not a virtue. It is a conclusion, one the world either earns from you or doesn't. We spent 50 years asking the wrong question. We asked, did the child have enough willpower to wait? The right question was, did the child have enough evidence to believe the second marshmallow was coming? The 4-year-old in that room in 1970 who looked at the marshmallow and ate it was not failing a test of who they would become. They were passing a test of something more fundamental, the ability to read the world they had been given and respond accordingly. Every financial decision you will make, the one you made last week, the one you are about to make, is shaped by the same calculation, not consciously, not deliberately, but shaped nonetheless by everything your life has taught you about whether the future is a place where things arrive as promised. So here is the rule for Monday. Before you treat impatience as a flaw, ask what evidence your environment has given you. Before you praise discipline, ask whether waiting is actually rational in the world you are living in. And before you judge someone else for not waiting, ask whether the second marshmallow was ever really there. Where did you learn? Whether to wait